This is American History TV's Lectures in History podcast. This week, Rider University professor Myra Gutin teaches a class on presidents and communications, from Teddy Roosevelt in the early 20th century to the present.
Welcome, everyone, to our second class. This is for the people who are here for the first time tonight. The Making of the President 2020, better known as the political circus of the century. I'm going to be talking about two different and yet related topics. The first has to do with the factors that are considered when we look at presidential effectiveness. The second part, I'd like to look at a few of the more recent presidential elections. So we're going to start with this, and I'm calling on the work of Professor Robert Dallek, a well-known presidential historian. Dallek writes, "The 20th century saw an unprecedented expansion of presidential powers, primarily due to the vision and leadership skills of 9 men who served in the office: Theodore Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Harry S. Truman, Dwight D. Eisenhower, John F. Kennedy, Lyndon Baines Johnson, Richard Nixon, and Ronald Reagan." Now, Professor Dallek's analysis only looks at the 20th century. I'm going to throw in some of the presidents from the 21st century as we go along. So if we can go to the first slide, Professor Dallek talks about these 6 points. The first one, he says, is vision. The second is charisma. I'm going to go back and talk about these. The second is charisma. The third is pragmatism. We'll move on to the next slide. The fourth is consensus building, followed by trust or credibility, luck, and then I'm going to throw in, which is on the last slide, and that is something that I'm going to call communication competence. Okay, and we're going to leave the slides behind for right now. So let's start with vision. Vision, according to Dallek, is that presidents come up with an idea and they help us to develop something that's going to pull us all together. It's going to be something that is going to unify us. Sometimes it comes to us as in a phrase: the New Deal, the New Frontier, the Great Society. These would be the things that are going to occur when we talk about vision. So let me talk about a few of the presidents then who were involved with this. And we're going to start with Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt was the first president of the 20th century, and he came to the White House at a time when the presidency was pretty weak. It was considered really to be certainly not what it is today. But Roosevelt began to expand that notion of it. And Roosevelt looks at the White House as an invitation to opportunity. And he talks about something that he calls the square deal and something that he calls the new nationalism. The square deal was the idea that people in America were not being treated fairly by the very wealthy in the country, by the trusts, which were groups of people that had come together in the industry to have certain sway over government. And this was going to be a way to deal with that and to make things a little more equitable, if you will. So the square deal was going to try to establish a balance between what had been the moneyed interests and give more back to the people. The same with the new nationalism. The new nationalism was supposed to try to protect human welfare and property, and just to generally improve the lives of Americans. Now, to go along with the vision, Theodore Roosevelt had an idea that all of us have benefited from. He was a conservationist, and it was because of him that we eventually had, and now have, the national park system. The national parks, of course, are enjoyed by millions of people every year, and they're an enduring legacy to TR. Another person with vision, Woodrow Wilson, who spoke about something called the New Freedom. He said that the New Freedom stood for the idea of restoring unfettered opportunity for individual action and being able to employ the power of the government on behalf of social justice. Now, it's kind of interesting that this comes from Wilson, because if you've been following what's transpired since the death of George Floyd, then you know that some of the ideas that Wilson expressed were racist in nature. But he didn't seem to propound those ideas while in the White House, and instead really did fight for some social justice revisions and legislation. Okay, if we're looking for the gold standard as far as vision, the person that we need to think about is Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Roosevelt, of course, comes to the White House at a most serious time in American history. It's the depths of the Depression. 25 million people are out of work. And he goes to the Democratic National Convention. He becomes the first modern presidential candidate to fly to a convention. Just the fact that he flew was a big deal, because presidential candidates were not flying around in the 1930s. But he flew to Chicago, and he stood in front of the people, and he said, I pledge myself to a new deal for the American people. And that showed extraordinary vision on the part of FDR. I assume that many of you know about some of the accomplishments of the New Deal, but during the first 100 days, and we now talk about 100 days of any presidential administration, some of the legislation that would become part of this New Deal is put into effect. And it includes things like the AAA, which is the Agricultural Adjustment Act. It includes FERA, the Federal Emergency Relief Agency. It includes the National Recovery Act. Now, interestingly, what finally pulls the country out of the Depression, and I just want to ask if anyone knows the answer to this, what is it that finally goes beyond the New Deal and gets the country out of depression? Does anyone know? Hard for me to see. Does someone want to speak out?
Yeah, World War II.
World War II. Thank you, Chase. Yes, absolutely. All of a sudden, putting people back into factories and being part of the war industries. And yes, finally, World War II lifts us up from the terrible hold of the Depression. Now, Roosevelt does something as part of his vision that speaks to communication and is really considered extraordinary in its own ways. He decides he is going to talk to the people on radio. And of course, the series of chats that he gives, the series of talks, become known as the fireside chats. Now, of course, what always makes me smile is that there was no fireside. He was speaking from the White House, but it didn't matter. People felt that Roosevelt was talking to them. Presidents had given speeches, but Roosevelt was talking to people. When Roosevelt died, a man stopped his wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, on the street. And he said to her, "Mrs. Roosevelt, I miss your husband. I miss the way that he used to talk to me about my government." It's extraordinary. Certainly no one would say that about any of our past presidents, perhaps in the last 25 or 30 years, certainly that I can recall. By the way, people seem to think that Roosevelt was constantly on the radio, constantly speaking and giving these fireside chats. In fact, over the almost, it was 13 years that he served in the White House, he gave 31. That was it. Moving on with the idea of vision, John F. Kennedy comes to the White House in 1960, and he talks about something called the new frontier. New is a big word for presidents. And Kennedy says that he wants to see money spent on social reform and welfare, as well as there being ambitious projects like going to the moon. Unfortunately, he never lived to see it, but it would happen before the end of the decade. Other things that happened during his time went along with this vision, but perhaps nothing more than something that he announced at my alma mater, the University of Michigan, and he announced it on the steps of the Student Union on October 28th, 1960 at midnight, when he told thousands of students that he was going to be proposing something called the Peace Corps. It remains today and is an enduring legacy of John F. Kennedy. One last person with a vision that he tried to follow through on was Lyndon Johnson, who followed Kennedy upon his assassination. And he talked about something called the Great Society. Johnson was never a great speaker, and we're going to talk about the importance of being a good speaker as president, but he too wanted very much to improve the life of citizens, and during his time in office, we get Medicare, civil rights passes, the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Johnson's reputation, unfortunately, is always associated with the Vietnam War, which he was mired in, couldn't get out of, and it forces him in March of 1968 to say in a radio address, I will not seek, nor will I accept another term as your president. He realized that he had lost credibility and things were just not going to go well from that point on. Okay, a second point that Professor Dallek talks about is charisma or dynamism. And what is being charismatic besides being dynamic? I think it means that it makes things exciting for people. Certainly, we've had presidents who have done that for us. I mentioned Franklin Roosevelt a few minutes ago with his use of radio, and he made it exciting for people to be involved with the recovery of the country. Things were getting a little better, and he was a cheerleader for that. John F. Kennedy, again, a lot of charisma. He was the youngest man to serve as president, and in so doing, there was a sense of vitality. And it was an exciting time to be an American. Some of you who are listening tonight may recall that there was a record album that came out during Kennedy's time in office. It's called The First Family, made terrific fun of the entire Kennedy clan. But the one who seemed to enjoy it most was John Kennedy. And when he was asked about it, he said, yeah, I thought Vaughn Meader, who impersonated him, did a nice job. But the truth of the matter is, I think he sounded more like my brother Teddy than he did like me. So there was that nice sense of self-deprecating humor. which was really very nice. Another president with great charisma, Ronald Reagan. Reagan, of course, had a background as he came from acting, then switched to politics later on in his life. Started life out, by the way, in case you're not familiar with this, as a Democrat, later became a Republican, and was elected as a Republican president in 1980. But again, there was always that sense of excitement that things were going to happen, that these people were not going to sit still. Finally, I'm going to include in that group Barack Obama. Barack Obama burst onto the political scene in 2004 when he gave the keynote address at the Democratic National Convention and excited a lot of people, and many people walked away from that and said, this young man has a good future coming in politics. And of course, 4 years later, he was running for president, and of course, he was elected. And we'll talk about this in a little bit, but he had tremendous rhetorical skills. He's a wonderful speaker, and that really stood him in good stead. As you can see on the slide, Professor Dallek also talks about pragmatism. Pragmatism, of course, is the idea of being practical, of being shrewd, of moving the country to where you think it should be. I'm only going to use one example here, and it does involve Franklin Roosevelt, but it's such a good example that I think it really does speak for itself. America was very isolationist. After World War I, the country simply did not want to get involved in any more foreign wars. A Neutrality Act had been passed so that technically you couldn't even declare war. Now, Roosevelt was watching what was going on in England. Actually, he was watching what was going on around the world. Hitler had come to power. Benito Mussolini had come to power with the fascists in Italy. There was a large movement towards militarism in Japan. And Roosevelt is aware of this, and he's watching it, but he can't do anything because the country and the Congress are isolationists. They don't want anything to do with anything. Things get really desperate for the English. They are being bombed mercilessly by Germany. By the way, if you want to read an excellent book about the bombing and what was going on at this point in the American-British relationship, I recommend to you a book by Eric Larson, came out this year, called The Splendid and the Vile. Wonderful history of what went on. At any rate, Churchill is appealing almost daily to Roosevelt, saying, please, we're not going to be able to hold out against Hitler much longer. And Roosevelt is trying to move the American public and the Congress towards helping, and they're not buying it. Finally, he gives a speech, and I'm just going to read a quick excerpt from the speech. And he says to them, he says to the Congress and to the country, suppose my neighbor's home catches fire, and I have a length of garden hose 400 or 500 feet away. If he can take my garden hose and connect it up with his hydrant, I may help him to put out his fire. Now, what do? I don't say to him before that operation, neighbor, my garden hose cost me $15. You will have to pay me $15 for it. What is the transaction that goes on? I don't want $15. I want my garden hose back after the fire is over. And what Roosevelt is doing is he's saying to the Congress and the American people, we have these old battleships and they're standing, they're in dry dock, and we're going to share them. We need to share them with the British people. And we're going to do like this garden hose. It's going to be a lend. The British are going to pay us, but then they're going to give them back. Now, Roosevelt knew they were never coming back, but it was the idea that he needed to move people forward. And he was very pragmatic about it. He used this speech, and Lend-Lease passed. We ended up aiding Britain, and you all know, fortunately, the end of the story. Moving on to consensus building. Consensus building is the idea of putting together a coalition, getting people to support you. And again, I'm only going to give you one example here, but it's from Lyndon Johnson, and it's with civil rights. It's maybe it's no surprise to anyone, but the opposition to civil rights was extreme. It was bitter. There were any number of votes that were taken earlier where civil rights was voted down. But finally, Lyndon Johnson, interestingly, a Southerner, is able to put together a coalition of Democrats and Republicans who believe in doing the right thing, in social justice. And Johnson goes out and he sells it to the people, and he gets the consensus, he builds the support, and civil rights passes. And it is the law of the land. Trust and credibility. If you have no trust and credibility, then you're pretty much kaput as president. If anyone remembers President Jimmy Carter. Carter lost his credibility over a number of things that he was doing, and it really doomed his presidency. For Johnson, for Lyndon Johnson, he lost that trust and credibility because of Vietnam. People just did not trust him anymore. The question has been raised, though I'm not sure that we'll see it play out yet for a while, whether President Trump has lost a lot of credibility with regard to coronavirus. We'll see. That one has yet to be to play out, and we'll see it this fall. I think that probably Donald Trump is very unlucky in that he was kind of moving along very well to re-election because the economy was quite good. And then coronavirus hit and turned all of our lives upside down. Now I have a question, and again, anyone, please go ahead and yell it out. Does anyone know, and it was in the 20th century, who is considered to be the unluckiest of presidents?
Probably Carter.
I can't hear you.
What? Coolidge?
Who would be considered to be the most unlucky president of the 20th century?
Nixon, maybe? President Nixon?
Why would President Nixon be considered the unluckiest president?
Watergate, maybe?
Well, think of, an event that really you can't control. Unfortunately, there were certain issues where President Nixon could have done some controlling with Watergate.
Okay.
Going once, going twice. Kennedy. Why would Kennedy be considered the unluckiest president?
Because he was assassinated.
Because, well, yeah, being assassinated definitely is a very unlucky thing, but no. Okay, I'm going to help you here. It was Herbert Hoover. Now, why Hoover? Well, Hoover comes to office in March of 1929. By the way, Herbert Hoover always gets a bad rap. He was really a very, very brilliant man, had fed much of Europe after World War I. Comes to the White House, he's in office, it's March, and in October of 1929, the stock market crashes and the Great Depression begins. One historian wrote that Herbert Hoover came to the White House poised for a grand job of building, and instead he was obliged to patch. He was pretty unlucky. Harry Truman used to say that Herbert Hoover did not create the Depression. The Depression was created for him, but it didn't matter. He could not help the United States to push out from the weight of the Depression, and he lost the election of 1932 to Franklin Roosevelt in a landslide. Okay, so understanding that luck would have this effect for certain presidents, again, it's the same thing for Donald Trump. He did not create coronavirus, but he is dealing with the effects of it. And we've been living through trying to get back to some degree of normalcy. I have one last thing to add. That is the point that I added, which is communication competence. I believe that this is important, and I base this on my own experience of watching presidents and studying them for a long time. What I found is that a president and presidential campaigners too, and you're seeing it right now, have to be both effective and their discourse appropriate. You need to be at least a decent speaker, better if you're a good speaker, best if you're an exceptional speaker. Okay, so among exceptional speakers, we would certainly have to put Barack Obama. We would have to put Franklin Roosevelt. Maybe in the next tier down, perhaps Bill Clinton. But these were people who could take advantage of situations rhetorically, and all of them also had the facility to adapt to changing conditions. If things suddenly could shift, then we know that they were able to respond rhetorically. Other parts of this too would be being grammatical correctness and cadence, being able to string ideas together. So if we were looking towards maybe the bottom layer, George W. Bush was not a particularly articulate president. Donald Trump is not particularly articulate, though he has the benefit of great resources in the media and getting his message out, but that's a different story. But communicator competence, is an issue. As we look at the 2020 race, I think that we're all wondering about Joe Biden and just how competent a speaker he is. Unfortunately, he's had his issues with gaffes over the years. So this is something that if they hired me right now to work with him, and by the way, Joe, I'm available to anyone, I would work with him on communicator competence and being able to frame thoughts and being able to produce good, strong rhetorical responses.
I have a question, if you don't mind.
Go, please, go.
So we talked about George Bush and Joe Biden, and they are both gaffe prone, but I've noticed that something a lot of people tend to like about them is that they have that folksy vibe, because they're not particularly eloquent. And so I was wondering how that plays into communication competence, because some people really do love that they sound like your uncle at a barbecue. They really just have that very hometown vibe.
I think that's a great point. I really do. I think with certain people, and I think that this does work for Joe Biden, and I think it did work for George W. Bush to a certain extent. The fact that they're not perfect really is not a terrible thing. Maybe it makes certain listeners more comfortable with them, and that's okay. I'm trying to think of others. Harry Truman was not a great speaker, but he was plain spoken, and there was no artifice. There was nothing fakey about his speech, and for that reason, people listened to him. Poor Truman, by the way, really had to deal with something that many of the others didn't have to. Remember who he followed into the White House. It was Franklin Roosevelt. And Franklin Roosevelt had died, and Truman became the president. And for a year after, many people referred to Truman as His Excellency. It was, he kind of was carrying a big load there, trying to continue with Roosevelt's programs. Certainly they were very, very big shoes to fill. So these are the qualities Professor Dallek teaches us of the effective presidents. But what about the less successful presidents of the 20th century? Dallek tells us that they lacked vision, or they failed to come up with a simple statement or a phrase to explain where they hoped to lead. I'm thinking here of three presidents of the 1920s: Warren Harding, Calvin Coolidge, and then Herbert Hoover. And I'm wondering if you ever studied these in history class or in political science or maybe even in communication, if you remember anything particular about any of those three. Does anyone have any memories of them? Haley?
I remember during the Depression, they called a lot of the really rundown, homeless people towns and stuff like that Hooverville. That's one of the things I remember.
Good for you.
And I went to a high school named after President Harding. So.
Oh, did you really? Oh, okay. Well, Warren Harding was a small town magazine publisher from Marion, Ohio. We wouldn't rank him among the more erudite, smarter presidents. At one point, his administration was trying to negotiate some financial legislation. And Harding said to one of his secretaries, I wish that there was a book that I could buy that would explain these economic points. And then he says, but darn, I probably wouldn't read it anyway. That's the kind of person he was. And there is a fair amount of scandal connected with Warren Harding, but you'll have to tune in another night and we'll talk about scandal. He's followed into office by Calvin Coolidge. Calvin Coolidge, a man of very, very few words. He was the one who said the business of America is business. Neither one of these gentlemen was a particularly articulate speaker, not very good communicators. Coolidge in particular, there's a story, maybe apocryphal, which means maybe it isn't true, but he said so few words that a woman sat down next to him at a dinner in the White House one night, and she said to him, Mr. President, I have a bet with someone that I can make you say more than 2 words. And he turned to her and said, you lose. That's the kind of person that he was. And of course, with Hoover, again, he was a brilliant mining engineer, but he was not a good communicator. Remember, too, that the 3 men that I mentioned, Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover, also did not have the benefit of radio. Radio really, comes into its own around 1927. And if memory serves me, Hoover does make a few speeches on the radio, but they don't use it very much. I haven't mentioned Dwight Eisenhower, and he was actually one of the better presidents. Was not a man, as historians would tell you, of many words, was not one of the greater communicators, but did have some vision. It's because of Eisenhower that we have the interstate road system that we have. So I don't know that I would put him as one of the more successful presidents. But the other things that we might consider with these less than successful presidents is that they weren't pragmatic enough to make the deals that needed to bring the country along to be in step with them. And they lacked the charisma and the strength of character to really, really lead. So as we look at all of these, I think you can see certain elements in every president, even those who we would call failures, had some of these qualities, probably not in great, not in a great amount, but perhaps there was a part of Harding that was pragmatic. Perhaps Coolidge did have some ability to have people trust in him. But the people that we remember are those that have all of the characteristics that Professor Dallek mentioned. Are there any questions? Otherwise, I'm going to tell you a little bit about some presidential campaigns, but any questions?
I had a question. So you said that President Wilson passed some social justice legislation while he was president. I was not aware of that, and I was wondering if you could give some examples, because I have heard some things that were pretty bad about him in the opposite direction, like that he resegregated the military. And it's also widely known about that he screened the pro-Klan film Birth of a Nation at the White House. So I was just wondering if you could explain some of that, because I was a little perplexed by that point.
Okay, and I just found out recently, you may have found it out before me, that while Wilson was the president of Princeton University, no Black students were admitted.
Yeah, I didn't know that, but I'm not surprised.
Yeah, and I don't know if a decision was made about this, but there was supposed to be something done with regard to the name of the Woodrow Wilson School of Public Affairs. I'm not sure if his name was removed from it.
Yes.
They voted to remove.
Was? Did they vote it? They voted to remove it. I wasn't sure. Okay, thank you. By the way, it might not surprise anyone that he wasn't really in favor of women getting the vote. But then when voting passed for women, when the 19th Amendment passed, he certainly went along with it. I always found it interesting that he didn't support the vote for women because he had 3 daughters. And you would think maybe. Okay, so I know that there was some legislation that was passed during his time in office that had to do with trying to do some things to increase public housing. And this came about as a practical solution because, and I don't mean to gross anyone out, but there were so many rats in Washington. And they were such a problem in some of the neighborhoods that he was in favor of it. Truthfully, Wilson's achievements are more in the area of foreign affairs than in domestic legislation. And I'm going to have to ask you to hang on to the next class, and I'll bring back some more examples because I've got to go back and just refresh my memory. And doing this right now, I'm just having trouble recalling, but I do remember the legislation about public housing. So just remind me about that for next time. Okay, very quickly. I want to shift gears and talk about a few elections and maybe just tell you a little bit about some of the communication elements that were functioning there, and also to possibly refer back to a few things that Professor Dalek said. Okay, well, you folks are going to be seeing a film very shortly. It's called Recount.
Oh.
And that is a film about the election of 2000. On the left side of the screen, you see pictures of Al Gore and Joe Lieberman, who's a senator from Connecticut, and George W. Bush and Richard Cheney. The election took place, and as some of you may remember or you may have read about, it seemed at first that Gore had won. And then it seemed that George W. Bush had won the state of Florida, so he had won. Al Gore, who was Bill Clinton's vice president, conceded. By the way, not one of the great communicators of all time. Nice guy, nicest guy in the world, but not a great communicator. And then it seems that there were some problems with the physical ballots being used in Florida. And because of that, as you're hearing right now, we might be waiting for maybe a few days, possibly a week, to have the results of the election of 2020 because of our use of mail-in ballots this year. Well, in 2000, we waited from election day until December 12th. And that is because of all of the litigation that took place in this particular race. It's a great story. If you're not familiar with it, you're going to learn all about it. But again, a fascinating election with an unexpected outcome. 2004 has never struck me as one of the more interesting of the elections. The incumbent was George W. Bush and Vice President Richard Cheney. The challengers were John Kerry, who was a senator from Massachusetts, and John Edwards, who was a senator from South Carolina. There was the vice presidential debate had the spectacle of Cheney absolutely wiping up the floor with John Edwards. At one point, Cheney said to Edwards, Senator Edwards, I go down to the Senate every Tuesday and I never see you. I don't recall having seen you. There was also a controversy that developed that had to do with something called the Swift boats. And we'll be talking more about it, but there were a group of veterans that said that some of the things that John Kerry was claiming that he had done during the Vietnam War really had not been his achievements. The debates between Kerry and George W. Bush, if I had to rank them on 1 to 10, I'd give them an because there wasn't any electricity. There certainly was no charisma. Even with that, though, Kerry came perhaps a little bit closer than was expected because Bush Cheney piled up 286 electoral votes to Kerry and Edwards 251. That brought us to 2008. And that was, again, another election to remember. On the left, and interestingly, please note that he has dark hair, is Barack Obama. And below him, that youngster from Delaware, Joe Biden. On the upper right, John McCain and Sarah Palin, the governor of Alaska. By the way, it's something interesting for you to do, which has nothing to do with anything. But take a look at the pictures of the presidents when they were inaugurated and look at them 4 years later. The changes are,
Professor.
yeah, they age. It is not an easy job by any means, and it just takes so much out of you. Today, Barack Obama is completely white-haired, and that's not uncommon for those who have served. Certainly you look at Bill Clinton, it's the same thing.
Professor.
Okay, so yeah, go ahead,
There's
please.
also a really good movie about this election produced by HBO. It's called Game Change.
Game change, thank you. Yes.
The woman who plays
Yes.
Sarah Palin, immaculate, truly. Highly recommend. Even if you don't like political movies, it's a very funny movie. I don't know if you've ever heard Sarah Palin talk.
Okay, and that comes from a book by John Heilman and Mark, and I can't think of Mark's last name, but the name of the book is Game Change. I had thought that maybe I would assign it to you, but the truth of the matter is it's 12 years ago already, and I wanted you, there's so much material being put out. That's fine. It's enough. So it's a hotly contested race. The debates between both Obama and McCain and Sarah Palin and Joe Biden are entertaining. If you watch the debate between McCain and Obama, you're going to notice something that you won't see in all presidential elections, and that is respect. Respect for each other. They may have been on very diametrically opposed politically, but they respected each other. Later on, we're going to be looking at some of the election humor from this year. And in particular, we're going to be looking at a Saturday Night Live recording of a debate, an appearance between Hillary Clinton, who lost the nomination to Barack Obama, and Sarah Palin. So that's something that's funny and something that we'll look forward to. 2012, a different election. The incumbents were Barack Obama and Joe Biden, and now Mitt Romney, who had been previously the governor of Massachusetts, and Paul Ryan, who was from Wisconsin. He was a congressman. He would later become the Speaker of the House. This is, I think, this is a lesson to us all in the fact that one comment can so very easily sink your ship. And one thing that really went far to sinking the ship of Mitt Romney in 2012 was a comment that he made when he was asked in one of the debates about women in his administration. And he made the unfortunate comment that he had a binder full of female names. Now that doesn't sound, it sounds pretty innocuous, but it got blown up, and he was ridiculed for it. It hurt. But there was also something very unlucky for Romney and Ryan in that election. And folks in New Jersey might really remember this. October of 2012. Do you remember an event that took place? If I told you it was a weather event.
Oh, Sandy.
Hurricane Sandy.
No one remembers.
Superstorm Sandy.
Sandy.
Superstorm Sandy, right. Some of you may remember that Barack Obama came to New Jersey, and he and Chris Christie had their arms around each other. And later on, the Republican campaign said that one really hurt. It was, it was certainly, not meant to be that way. But boy, there we have a media image that just ends up hurting Mitt Romney. They're defeated. And that's that. Okay, 2016. We are going to spend a lot more time on 2016 in future classes. I think everyone should remember this pretty clearly. Of course, it was Hillary Clinton against Donald Trump, Tim Kaine, the senator from Virginia, and Mike Pence, the former governor of Indiana. I've said this before. I might have even said it in the first class, but I'm going to say it again. And that is, if someone tells you that they knew that Donald Trump was going to win in 2016, they knew it, they were convinced, they're full of baloney. There was nobody who identified Trump as the likely winner in 2016. 538, Real Clear Politics, Morning Consult, everybody thought that Hillary Clinton was going to win. Even Trump did not think he was going to win. Though I've always wondered about that because I think he's a very competitive man. And I think that as the election went along, his audiences grew, the enthusiasm for him grew, and I think that he really enjoyed it. And I will tell you that I know that Melania Trump was not very happy about the win. She certainly had no desire to be first lady, but she's there in the White House. So there are a number of reasons, of course, why Clinton lost in 2016, but it wasn't the debates. By almost every source that I've been able to pull up, everyone ranked her as winning all three presidential debates. The vice presidential debate was kind of a blah affair. Nothing really much came out of it, but it was those three presidential debates. Hillary Clinton is a good speaker. She's very articulate. Trump, not as much, but he also had a particular charisma which she didn't like. Which she didn't have. This was an election between two candidates that people did not particularly like. It's been said, if Joe Biden has one thing going for him in 2020, it's that he's likable. So, you can sort of factor that in. So these are just this is just a quick look at the 2016 election. And we'll go back and be revisiting it. As we go forward, think of those qualities that Professor Dallek tells us to consider in presidential effectiveness, and you can even look for it in campaigning. And we will be continuing our discussion in our next session, and I look forward to seeing you then. Have a good evening.
Thanks for listening. Please rate, review, and subscribe to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts. We would love to hear from you. You can email us at podcasts@c-span.org.